Hello, my name's Lesley Atherton and this is my short story called Usually Restrained. Ruth had made a sale to Christine Wilson, a set of envelopes and matching writing pad in powder blue. The stationery was in fairly bad taste, Ruth thought, but the post office chose to sell it, so Mrs. Wilson was entitled to buy it without undue comment. But it wasn't the pad and envelopes that had caught Ruth's eye, it was the change in her neighbour. Mrs. Wilson, a middle-aged regular of the Padding Green post office, was that day dressed in most uncharacteristic manner, a jarringly bright cheesecloth gypsy top, adorned with white embroidered geometry, all of which clashed enormously with her newly reddened hair and long swirling skirt. The woman was barely recognisable, and Ruth couldn't help wondering why. Ruth had been polite and civil, yet all the while she just wanted to rip the stupid purple beret from Christine's head. Ruth humbly believed that Christine was the most unpleasant mutton of a woman. Nevertheless, Ruth restrained herself from speaking out. Selective mutism wasn't usually one of her talents, but today seemed to be a day for uncharacteristic actions. Ruth's clothing, in direct contrast to Christine's, was definitely restrained. Today she wore a brown cord A-line skirt, a simple white blouse and sensible brogues. Her life was restrained too, she being happily unencumbered with husband, children or pets. But was she restrained? Was she really? It was closing time, and Christine Wilson had been Ruth's final customer. The bile rose in Ruth's stomach as she locked the post office's front door and trudged into the back rooms to change into her outdoor clothes. Christine made her sick, and suspicious too. Why on earth would Christine Wilson, of all people, change her appearance so completely? The woman was 57 years old and didn't work, though she did collect her late husband's pension. Ruth knew for a fact that Harry would have been fuming to see his wife turned out looking no better than a hippy whore. Harry, like Ruth, believed in the sanctity of a woman's submission to her male master. Ruth's smart yet ageing coat, fashioned for a lady much older than her 42 years, nevertheless actually suited her grim countenance. Her naturally platinum blonde hair, which could have been striking, elegant or even pretty on another woman, was on Ruth simply platinum blonde hair, loosely pulled into a baggy ponytail. Ruth wore no makeup, and her creamy, clear, youthful skin was surprisingly unbeautiful. She slammed the post office's rear door behind her as she smiled wryly and began her short walk home. Mrs. Christine Wilson, indeed. Mrs. Christine Wilson was short, fat and ugly, that's what Ruth thought. The ugliness came from within, it came from being untrue to the principle of loving and obeying one's betters, one's husband, one's master. Of course, Ruth knew where Mrs. Wilson lived, she knew where everyone lived, but especially knew a lot about Christine. She knew how much Harry had earned, about Christine's secret eating, and about all the other things Christine did behind closed doors. Oh yes, Ruth knew. As she walked home through the damp autumnal streets, her brown flat shoes darkened in the many puddles. As she walked home through the damp autumnal streets, her pale hair glowed under street lamps. As she walked home through the damp autumnal streets, the anger made her eyes glisten and flicker as she thought again of Mrs. Wilson. Dirty trollop. Now there was a female who needed to be shown her place. That night, when she returned home, speckled brown and dirtied by mud and puddle water, Ruth ran her bath and stripped out of her soiled clothing, placing it carefully in her laundry basket. Her home was simple, stark and bland, and contained none of the knickknacks normally associated with a single female's abode. The hot water and scented bath salts did work some magic, and Ruth soon smiled to herself, seeing things much more clearly. Mrs. Christine Wilson. Perhaps she'd pay her a visit very soon. And as the bath water drained down the plug hole, a demurely dressed Ruth opened her kitchen cupboard. Her hunger had been hurting her throughout the day, but she was necessarily in control. The cupboard was almost bare, as her disciplined approach was to purchase only what she needed each day, usually from the shop adjoining the post office. This technique kept her cupboards empty, her figure trim and her purse full. The only contents of the cupboard today were tinned ham, 2 potatoes and a tin of garden peas. Ruth nodded approval at the adequate and nourishing meal. Her appetite self-regulated. She ate for sustenance and without pleasure. Meal soon finished, Ruth took herself to bed and knelt to one side of it. Hands together, eyes closed. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. The clock ticked loudly. She continued, on earth as it is in heaven, give us this day our daily bread. Something must be done about Christine bloody Wilson, and tomorrow would be the day when it would be done. The following morning, Christine Wilson found herself staring once again at the white marble urn holding her husband Harry's ashes. Just a few days before his death from lymphatic cancer, he had asked her to hold on to them for 5 years, then sprinkle them at Liverpool Airport. It wasn't an odd request, given his interest in aircraft spotting. He also asked her to dress in the style she had adopted at the time they first met. Already deep in grief for her impending loss, Christine had agreed, though she had to admit to regretting her prompt acquiescence a little now. The 5-year anniversary was almost with her. She'd already purchased a suitable outfit and tried it out the previous day when she bought writing paper and envelopes at the post office. She would certainly not be wearing them again once the day was over, as the too long skirt and too frivolous blouse were both years too young for her. But she had promised Harry, and there was no way she was going to let him down. Christine was nervous, but couldn't pretend that the sprinkling day hadn't arrived. She shivered and grimaced. Yes, she needed to finally put her husband to rest so that she could get on with the rest of her life. She pulled her coat on over her unaccustomed clothes, picked up the keys to her Morris Minor and kissed the urn gently. How she still mourned for him. "Today's the day, Harry," she whispered, and closed the door softly behind herself. The ashes did get sprinkled that day. They were sprinkled by Ruth as she jumped on poor Christine and beat her to the ground. Ashes and blood mingled on her own doorstep. It wasn't quite the goodbye that Harry had requested, but at least they were going to be together again. She, in her hippie girl outfit, was merged forever with the essence of him, as the tiny silver-grey granules leaked onto the cobbles to be covered in Christine's blood outside the home they'd shared.